So when I was in premarital counseling with Rebecca, if you haven't met my wife, Rebecca, she's in the room. We all have jobs when we're starting a church. And so, yeah, she's right there. Okay. When me and Rebecca, she doesn't know I'm telling the story. When me and Rebecca were in premarital counseling, we were 20 and 21. And I was in college. You had just graduated from college, right, Rebecca? Yeah. And she's like, what story are you telling? We were doing premarital counseling. We went through this book with our mentor. We had this book, and I've got it right here. I still have it. This is the actual book that I used in premarital counseling over 10 years ago. And one of the things that we had to do is we had to talk about our past and our life plan. So we had to map out our life from the family that we were raised in and the home that we were raised in, what we saw our parents do, all that stuff. Many of you might have gone through something similar. And then what we had to do is we had to map out our future and to think, okay, well, what are our expectations? What are the things that we are going to value the most? What are the things that matter most to me? And then we would do this without actually consulting one another. Like we would actually go through this and we would do this workbook and we would write in it and we would give our own answers. And the idea was that we'd do it without each other, and then we would come together and we would discuss our answers. And for those of you who are married, you know why that's a really good idea. Because if I come and say, hey, these are my expectations, and Rebecca's like, those aren't mine, that could be a big problem, right? Well, one of the questions that it asked me when I was 20 years old was, what have been the greatest accomplishments, or what have been, let me see if I can get this right. I've got this dog-eared. What have been your greatest triumphs in life? What have been your greatest triumphs in life? And I remember thinking, I was like, man, I'm 20 years old. I was like, what triumphs have I had? I've had a relatively easy life. I grew up in a great home, never had a concern about what I was going to eat or where I was going to sleep or what clothes I was going to wear or anything like that. I hadn't really done much. I mean, like when I was in high school, like my junior year or something like that, my soccer team made it to the state tournament, and we were in the penalty shootout, if you know what I'm talking about. They kick penalty kicks at the end of the game. It's tied, and they've got penalty kicks to decide it. And when it came to my turn to kick my penalty kick, it was either that I miss, or either that I make it and we go on, or I miss and we lose and we're done. Our season's over. And I remember even a friend leaning over to me and saying, hey, don't screw this up. And I was like, that's a great teammate right there. But I actually made it. I scored. And we went on, and we didn't win the state championship. But that was about the only thing that I could think of. Well, that was my greatest triumph. Like, well, what had I accomplished at that point? And then I started to think about my life, and I thought about my story, and I thought about where I had been. And I started to think about the last year. When I was 20 years old, the last year of my life was filled with a bunch of change. A bunch of change. I had grown up in the church, but I'd never really been all in on Jesus. And he radically changed my life that year. And what I got to be a part of was this growing ministry on my campus where I got to be a part of people coming to know Jesus. Like I got to be involved in somebody else experiencing life change multiple times. I got to teach. I started following Jesus in December of my junior year of college and was teaching by March and April of my junior year of college. And I remember like people I used to party with and stuff, they would come to these big worship gatherings where I was teaching, and then afterwards they'd be like, I can't believe they're letting you do that. Like I don't understand. Like don't they know who you are and stuff? Like you like the hypocrite of all hypocrites, man. And I was like, no. Let me explain to you what has happened in my life in the last 6 months. And I got to see a lot of life change happen because of that. I got to see like a whole movement on my campus of people coming to Christ and then leading other people to Christ. And I realized that none of those things are my triumphs. You understand? Like that's not me doing anything. That's not me being a great preacher. That's not me being a great disciple maker, great mentor, or anything like that. That's not me even like having a youthful zeal for God or any kind of holiness. I was still extremely broken, extremely messed up. But God had triumphed in my life. And so what I wrote as my greatest triumphs in life were the times that I allowed myself to be used by God. It says it right there in my 20-year-old handwriting. The times when I allowed myself to be used by God. And I remember vividly the fervor, the zeal that I had as a 20-year-old, where I thought, if you would have asked me, what's the thing that you want to be written on your gravestone? What's the thing that you want to be your legacy? What's the thing that you want to be true of your life? The number one thing, the only thing, the thing that I cared about the most would have been, honestly, it would have been, I want to be used by God. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know where I'm going. I think I know who I'm going to do it with. But whatever it means, I want to be used by God. And here's what's behind that. I believe unapologetically, did then and do now, unapologetically, that there are very few things in life that actually ultimately matter. That life is actually very simple. And for some of you, you're walking in the room, you're like, well, life is really complicated and complex. I'm going to give you some really good news this morning. I'm going to give you some really good news that life is actually very, very simple, because very few things matter ultimately. And I wanted to give myself to the things that mattered most. I wanted to give myself to being used by God. In other words, I wanted to give myself, I wanted to give my life over to doing what actually matters. I wanted to live the life fully that God put me on this earth to do. If there is any result of my life, I want it to be that I was used by God to do exactly what I am here to do. The problem is, how do you do that? Have you ever wondered that? Like the people who are used by God in amazing ways. You probably have somebody in your life maybe that has been used by God in some amazing ways. Maybe you know of somebody who's well known, maybe a historical figure, or maybe a current person. But the people who are used by God in some amazing ways, or the people who see God move in their life, in their homes, in their organizations, in their neighborhoods, whatever the case may be, the people that seem to just be there every time God moves, they're like in the picture, like they've been a part of it. The people who have been used by God for great things, or have been greatly used by God for small things, how do they do it? How does one become someone whom God would use? All of us in this room are wondering what we're here for. All of us in this room have this need, whether we have put our finger on it or not. We have this itch, we have this weight on us to make our life matter. And what that is that we have an innate sense as a human being that we exist for a purpose. This is one of the big differences between us and animals. That we are not driven by instinct. And so we look at our lives and we think, okay, well, what am I here for? What was I put here for? If you're a person of faith, what does God want from me out of my life? And I unapologetically believe that there is something that God has put you here for, and your life is what He created it to be when you are accomplishing that purpose. For some of you, that causes a whole lot of anxiety. It causes a whole lot of nervousness, because you're like, well, I got to find that one little path. I got to find that job, that spouse, that city I'm going to live in. I got to find whatever it is that God wants from me. That's not so much of what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the small little details of life. I'm not talking about like who you're going to marry. I'm not talking about what job you're going to have, what city you're going to live in, or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the ultimate purpose that God has put on your life. And we'll talk about it in just a second. The ultimate purpose that God has put on your life. How do you become a person? How does your family become a family, a home? How do your kids become the humans? How do you cultivate a life where you become the kind of person that God can use for what He wants to use you for? Here's the answer. 2 words. Consecration and desperation. Consecration and desperation. Consecration is a fancy religious word, and you don't have to remember it or anything like that, but I hope you do. But the concept is what really matters. And you don't hear us use a whole lot of fancy words around New City. You don't hear us use a lot of fancy religious language here, because a lot of people use fancy religious language or theological language or whatever the case may be, because it makes them feel smarter, it makes them feel more holy, and it can kind of prop themselves up and stuff. And at New City, we're very much about using language that includes everybody. The problem with fancy theological language is that sometimes, most of the time, it's not words that we use in everyday life. You know what I mean? And so people walk in and I say a word like consecration, and you're like, I don't really understand what that means. And I promise you at New City, we don't use these words very often, but this is such a powerful word. Such a powerful word, consecration, that I think we can learn a lot from it. What is consecration? Consecrating, to be consecrated to something, this is all over the Bible, is to be set apart for God's use. In the Old Testament, they consecrated the temple, the house of God. They consecrated the place where God's presence would dwell. They consecrated the altar. They consecrated the priests, and sacrifices were made. They consecrated an animal to sacrifice to God. They would take their best animal. They would take their first crop, and they would consecrate it to the Lord. It was you taking something and you setting it apart for the sake of God's use, whatever that use may be. Are you with me? And so you would take something and you would set it apart for God's use. Check out Exodus 29. This is where God's giving them instructions about how to consecrate the priests, the people who would represent God to the people and represent the people to God. This is what it says, Exodus 29, starting in verse 1. It says, "This is what you are to do to consecrate them," that is the priests, "so they may serve as priests. Take a young bull and 2 rams without defect, and from the finest wheat flour make round loaves without yeast, thick loaves without yeast, and with olive oil mixed in, and thin loaves without yeast and brushed with olive oil. Put them in a basket and present them along with the bull and the 2 rams. Then bring Aaron," that's one of the guys who is being consecrated to be a priest, "bring Aaron and his sons to the entrance of the tent of meeting," that's like the temple, that's the tabernacle, "and wash them with water. Take the garments and dress Aaron with the tunic, the robe of the ephod, and the ephod itself, and the breastpiece. Fasten the ephod on him on him by its skillfully woven waistband. Put the turban on his head and attach the sacred emblem to the turban. Take the anointing oil and anoint him by pouring it on his head. Bring his sons and dress them in tunics and fasten caps on them. Then tie sashes on Aaron and his sons. The priesthood is theirs by a lasting ordinance. Then you shall ordain Aaron and his sons." So you see that, you're thinking, okay, well, I'm supposed to be consecrated. That seems like a wild thing right there. Like, I don't know if I want to go through that kind of a ceremony. That's not what I'm talking about. Much of that is symbol, but there's 3 things going on here. There's 3 things that are involved in consecration. And I'm getting this from a pastor in New York named John Tyson. And there's 3 things involved in consecration. That is being made clean, cleansing. That is sacrifice, and that is dedication. Cleansing, sacrifice, and dedication. Something is made clean, sacrifices are made, and something is dedicated to the purpose of God. So if you were to be consecrated, if you were to be set apart for the purpose of God, then something's got to be cleansed, sacrifice is going to have to be made, and you are going to be dedicated to the work that God has for you. Let's talk about cleansing. Let's talk about being made clean. Psalm 24, 3-4 says, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place?" In other words, who may be in the presence of God? Who may experience God, a move of God? Who may experience God's presence in their lives? Who is it that gets to do that? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in an idol or swear by a false god. Last week we talked about how David wrote in a psalm that there's one thing that he seeks, one thing in life that he cares about, and that is to seek God's face in his temple, to be in the presence of God. He says, there's one thing that I want to devote my life to, and that is seeing God, experiencing the presence of God, dwelling in God's presence. That's that one thing. Well, who gets to do that? Same writer. Somebody with clean hands and somebody with a pure heart. Those are the only people who get to ascend the mountain of the Lord. Those are the only people who get to experience the presence of God. And you think, oh, is that me? Don't check out. There's more coming. Sacrifices. So there's a cleansing, there's a cleaning, but then there's also a sacrifice to be made. There may be sacrifices to be made. Check out Romans 12:1. It says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. That's the act of consecration. You are offering yourself as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, because this is your true and proper worship. A move of God is only experienced by those who are ready to make the sacrifice. A move of God costs something. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about it in just a second. The last thing is dedication. Dedication. Check out Acts 1:14. This is at the beginning of one of the greatest stories of a move of God in the entire Bible, the beginning of the church. Here in just a couple of chapters in the Bible, 3,000 people are going to come to know Jesus, and everything is going to change. The world is going to be turned upside down. This is what happened right before that. Jesus was with his disciples at this point, not just the 12, but everybody who was following him. And at this point, there's about 120 people. And Jesus says, hey, you need to wait for power to come. You're going to wait for my Holy Spirit, and then you are going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So he says, wait for my power. Wait for me to move. And then you're going to be a part of the greatest move of God history has ever seen. And this is what it says about these people. It says, all these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. You see the word devotion there. The word devotion pops up a few times at the beginning of the church. But notice in this spot where they are devoting themselves to, or what they are devoting themselves to. They're devoting themselves to prayer. Jesus said, you're going to wait on my power. You're going to wait for me to come. You're going to wait for me to move. Because what I have called you to do, the purpose that I have for your life, you are not able to accomplish it on your own. You are not able to achieve it. I'm not asking you to do something that I'm completely counting on you to do, because I'm asking you to do something that you absolutely cannot do. Anybody feel like that? Anybody feel like God is asking them to do something that they cannot do? There is a myth out there that God will never give you something that you cannot handle. That is ridiculous if you read your Bible. God only gives us things that we cannot handle. Why? So that we be devoted to prayer, to Him. We'll talk about that in a second. The devoted. In fact, that devotion to prayer, that need for God, that knowing that we can accomplish what God has put in our lives on our own, that leads us to our second main words. We have consecration, being set apart for the purposes of God, which involves being made clean. It involves sacrifice, and it involves being dedicated. And then we talk about desperation. So it's one thing to go through a bunch of rituals. It's one thing to be dedicated, to like literally go through the ritual of dedication. You know, it's one thing like if you were Aaron and the priests. You know, like if you were there, it's one thing to have the headdress put on and have the special robe to be put on and have the sacrifices made on the altar and to have the sash put on and the breastpiece and all of that crazy stuff that it talked about. It's one thing to go through all of that ritual and to quote-unquote consecrate yourself to the Lord. But what we're talking about is not a ritual. What we're talking about is something of the heart. something that we do with our lives, something that we do with our very selves, all of who we are. It's a posture that we take towards God. And that posture is desperation. It's desperation. John Tyson, the same guy who kind of came up with this list of 3 things that our consecration is. John Tyson also says this really just compelling, amazing line. He says, God comes where he's wanted. So you've ever wondered about all these different moves of God in history? Even if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you don't know anything about church history or anything like that, you've heard of things like the Great Awakening, you've heard of things like Azusa Street Revival, you've heard of things of different stuff throughout all of history, Welsh revivals, and all over. Like God has showed up in some very special ways throughout history, and the question is, like, why does he come there? Like, why does God show up there? Like, I was in a room with the campus pastor, essentially, that was the campus pastor who preached the sermon right before the revival at Asbury University. Do you know what I'm talking about? You guys watch the news? You're aware of the revival that happened in Asbury. It's a small Methodist school in the South. And I was in a room with this guy. And he was talking about that day. And he was saying how, like, it's kind of wild because everyone, like, he's gotten a lot of attention. Like, everyone, like, wants to meet him. Everybody wants to talk to him. He's on podcasts now. He's got a book deal now and all this stuff. And he was well-deserved. I'm not saying anything is not deserved. But he's getting all of this attention now because everybody wants to know, like, what led to that? Like, what led to thousands and thousands and thousands of people from all over the world landing on Asbury University just to experience a real move of God? What led to that? And they asked, like, well, what did you preach on? Like, what was your sermon? And stuff like that. And he's like, I don't know. So what was the, like, music like? What was going on? What was the lighting? What was all of that? Like, well, how did you do this? He's like, I don't know. I heard him literally say something to the effect of, he texted his wife, and he said, sermon was okay, might stop and pick up dinner coming home. Except that a few college students just wanted to stay. They just wanted to stay. By Zach's own account, that's his name, by Zach's own account, the sermon was not that great. Chapel that morning was not that great. It wasn't anything crazy. But a few students wanted to stay. Why? Because they wanted more of God. So they stayed. And they stayed. And they stayed. And what happened was more and more and more started to show up. More and more started to feel this desperation for God. And next thing you know, there's this move of God that is waking people up around the country that, oh, God might actually want to do something in our generation. Because these students were desperate. They wanted God. They wanted to see a move of God in their life. They were desperate. Check out Psalm 63. This is David in one of the hardest places in his life, the hardest points in his life. He says, you, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you. In a dry and parched land where there is no water, I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love, check this out, is better than life. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live. And in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. God comes where he's wanted. Can you imagine wanting God that much? Your love is better than life. I will be fully satisfied in you. We need consecration We need desperation. And you think, okay, well, this is great, Justin, like, amazing. Like, I want to see a move of God just like anybody else, but I've got stuff going on at home. I've got this issue with my kid. My marriage is struggling. I'm not sure about finances right now. My job is just like, something's got to be changed there, and I don't know what to do. I've got an aging parent, and I'm having to deal with that right now. My dating history just sucks, and I feel like such a loser. And I don't know how to do anything with that. Or, God, man, I've tried to do the things of God, man. Like, I've tried to be a good witness to my neighbors. I've tried to serve well. I've tried to get back in tune with my relationship with Jesus. I've come back to church, but I'm like off and on, and I just don't know. I've got old habits that I keep going back to. Like, I just don't know. Like, you're talking about move of God stuff. I'm just trying to get through the next week. Let me tell you, this is not just about like national revival. This is not just about like the entire world being turned upside down. This is about you and I being turned upside down. This is about our homes experiencing a move of God. This is about our neighborhoods experiencing a move of God. This is about our workplaces experiencing a move of God. This is about our own hearts experiencing a move of God. And what will it take? It will take consecration, and it will take desperation. So you want God to move in those things. I promise you, God wants to move in those things. And God might be up to something. That's a really important question that you might be asking. Is like, if you feel like you are in the valley of the shadow of death, you need to understand that God is with you, and He may be doing something. The right question may not be, when is God going to take me out of this? The right question might be, what is God doing in this? Well, I promise you, no matter where you are, consecration and desperation are what you're after. Consecration and desperation are what you're after, because what you are really after is God Himself. So consecration and desperation. This is what we need. And then in our church. I said it last week, and I'll say it again. We did not start New City for the sake of New City. We started New City to make a city new. Our prayer is never, God, grow our church. Our prayer is, God, grow the church in Austin. We said before we moved to Austin that if we were to plant a church and our church grew and the church in Austin did not grow, then we would consider it a failure. We would consider it a failure if we had this large gathering of people in this room and it made no difference to anybody outside of these doors. We would consider it a failure if our church had great music and great preaching and a great kids program and a youth group someday and a college ministry and all of this cool stuff. We would consider it a failure if we had all this great stuff going on and God wasn't in it. You know you can plant a church without God? It's done all the time. We don't want to do that. We want to be a people who see and are a part of a real move of God. And so we as a church, just as us as individuals, us as family units, as homes, we want to consecrate ourselves. We want to be made clean. We want to sacrifice whatever it costs. And we want to sacrifice whatever it costs, and we want to dedicate ourselves, devote ourselves to the purposes of God. And we want to take the posture of desperation because we need Him. See, like, how do I actually apply this to my life? Like, how do I actually do this? But there's this great verse in a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. 2 Timothy 2:20 through 21, it says, in a large house, there are articles or vessels, or think pots, pans, pitchers, cups, bowls. There are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes, and some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for the special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared for any good work. What does that mean? That some are set apart, some are made, some are, what does that say? You pull it up over here. I'm going to look on the TV. It said, I can't see it. I'm going to look over here. It said, go back one. It says, in a large house there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes and some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter. Those who cleanse themselves from common use will be instruments of what? Special purposes, made holy. So what does that mean? There are some vessels, there are some things in your house that are special. They're proper, right? They're things that you use for special occasions. Like when I was growing up, my mom had china. And we never used it, but it was there, right? And some of you, maybe your mom or your grandma, or maybe you have fine china. I have no idea. But you would set it out on table when people were coming. But sometimes you would set out regular dishes when people coming, and your kids would pick up on who's really important, who's not, based on the plates and the forks and all that stuff that you use. I do the same thing. I do the same thing in my life. There are things that I use, when I really want to have a really good time alone with God in the morning. Admittedly, this is superstitious and completely unbiblical. Okay? But when I want to have a really good time with God in the morning, I got a coffee mug that I use above all other coffee mugs. Because this is my signal to myself and to God, saying, hey, this one's going to be important, God. We're gonna get some stuff done this morning and stuff like that. The other coffee mugs don't make me feel as close to God. You've got these vessels in your house that are more important. Some used for special use, some used for common use. What's the difference? Is it what they're made out of? Notice it said that some are gold and silver and some are just wood and clay. But is that what it points out as the difference between those that are used for special use and those that are used for common use? That's not what it says. That's not what it points out as the difference. What's the difference? That the ones that are used for special use cleanse themselves of being used for common things. They cleanse themselves for being used for common things. Let's see how this works here. Okay, I'm going to actually move my iPad to safety over here. Okay, so you've got a vessel, an article. This is a special one. If you come over to our house and you see lemonade in a plastic pitcher, you know what you mean to us. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. This is a vessel right here. It's just a vessel. Not special, not common, just a vessel. It's not about what you're made out of. You understand? It's not about whether you're gold and silver or whether you're wooden and clay. And a lot of us will look around, especially in this age of social media, and we'll compare ourselves to other people. I'm not as gifted as that person. I'm not as charismatic as that person. I'm not as holy as that person. I'm not made of the same stuff as that person is. But that's not the difference. That's not what God talks about. You're just a vessel. It's not about what you're made of. You're just a vessel. And the problem is that for most of us, we're filled with a bunch of stuff that will kill us. If this goes viral on YouTube, I'm probably in trouble. Okay. We're filled with a bunch of stuff that will kill us. Right? Just going to do this right here. They use this fizz on commercials to whet your appetite, but this will clean barnacles off the side of a boat. Now here's the thing, this stuff is delicious. I didn't go to H-E-B to go get this. This is in my house. This stuff is amazing. It's incredible. It tastes amazing. Just like that thing you're looking at on the internet. It's really, really, really good for a moment. But ultimately it'll kill you. Or it's that anger problem that you keep feeding. When you're angry, you just get on social media and you just fuel the rage machine. Or you're in your car and you're rehearsing arguments that you haven't ever had in your life before, and you're like, you win them all. You know what I'm talking about? With your boss, with your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, sibling, parent, child. Just fueling the rage machine. You're fueling the lust. You're feeding it. You're giving it more and more and more. And it's just, hey, just this time. Next time, I won't, but this time, I will. And a lot of it, it's not even sinful stuff. You know what I mean? Like a lot of it, like common use is not bad. You know what I mean? Like it didn't say some vessels are used for special use and others are used for sin. Like that's not what it says. It says that some are used for special use and some are used for common, everyday use. And listen, God exists in the mundane. God exists in the everyday. I'm not saying that every moment in life has got to be a mountaintop moment with God. That's not how it works. God exists on the ground with you and me every day. But common use would be something like, I'm just going to spend hours on Netflix. Feels good. I'm going to just veg out on my phone for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day. I'm going to just, on these dating apps, just going to keep trying to find someone to fulfill me. Dating's not bad. Dating apps aren't wrong. Just if you're giving your life to them, if you're devoting your life to it, it's at least a waste. I should have brought like 7 more cans. What happens is you get filled up with things that taste really good, that are really, really, really good. But you know the thing about Coca-Cola, and you know the thing about common use, is that it's actually designed to leave you thirsty. David is hiding in the desert. And he says, your love is better than life. I will be fully satisfied in you. This stuff won't just kill you eventually. Even if you drink it in moderation, even if you just say, well, I'm not going to go overboard, but I'm just going to be a regular person. It's still chemically designed to make you want another one, and another one, and another one. What is it designed for? It's designed to leave you unsatisfied, and it won't give you life. And so consecration is getting rid of this. Because your life is a vessel. It is limited. You are not immortal. You are not eternal. You do not have unlimited resources. You do not have unlimited time, unlimited energy, unlimited relational capacity, unlimited emotional capacity. You don't have unlimited money. You don't have unlimited anything. You are very, very limited. And you have to live within your limits. You've got a certain amount of space that you could fill up here. And a lot of us, we don't have any space We're filled up all the way to the top. And so we don't have any space for God to move at all. We want God to make a difference. We want God to move in our lives, and we want God to use us in other people's lives. We want to be used by God. But the thing is God cannot use someone who is unavailable to be used. If you're filling yourself up with just junk. And what consecration is not just like, okay, you're right. I'm gonna. There, God. This is what you got to work with. That's not what God's after. Romans 1 says that offer your bodies as living sacrifices, to give all of yourself to God. And so that your capacity to be used by God really is directly related to your capacity to get rid of this and to empty up enough space for God to use. Does that make sense? In the Bible, God uses all kinds of people who weren't ready for this. But what he does before he uses them is he brings them to a point where they are empty. You know what I'm saying? Like they're not here. They're not empty, ready to receive God's power. But God will put them through circumstances. God will lead them through a roadmap of their life where this gets drained so more space can open up so God can use them. This is true of everybody in the scriptures and everybody who God has ever used. There's always been something before the public thing, before the accomplishment, before the whatever triumph that they experienced in their life because of a move of God. Before that, there was something in private. And it was this. Every single day, a constant just pouring out. A pouring out. Get it out of me, God. Like imagine what God can do with that. Like imagine what God can do if you, instead of, and I'm speaking to myself, I'm preaching to myself. I have not accomplished this in life. I have not arrived here. I'm preaching to myself as much as anybody. But what can you imagine what God could do with that? What if you, instead of watching Netflix every night, spent that time going on a prayer walk in your neighborhood, asking God to move in the lives of your neighbors? What if instead of filling this with time on your phone when you wake up, you would set your phone somewhere in another room and you said, I'm not looking at my phone, I'm not touching it, I'm not even thinking about it until I have filled myself up with more of God? What if? And many of you in your head, you're thinking, oh, I've got this excuse, I've got this excuse, I've got this excuse. That's totally fine. This is not about salvation. This is not about being right with God. Anything God in salvation, he does that for you. That's the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus, is that you are filled to the brim with garbage, and he emptied it out, and he replaced it with his full God, life-giving spirit. And he's the one who makes you new. What I'm talking about is being used by God. What I'm talking about is being used as a vessel to see a real move of God in your life. Because when you have this space, when you create space for God to move, he begins to fill you with the good stuff. The stuff that does quench thirst. The stuff that does give life. The stuff that even overflows to other people. He begins to fill you up. Look, in the moment, in the short term, that's not as fun. Doesn't taste as good going down. It's not as exciting. But over the long term, when you consecrate yourself, you are desperate, empty, like an empty vessel, saying, I need you. to fill me. You set yourself apart. You say, I'm here, God. All of me. Completely empty. And you will see a move of God in your life, in your home, in your heart. And if we as a church can together set ourselves apart, cleanse ourselves of common use, and be used for uncommon use. Empty ourselves so that we have room to be used for uncommon use. Then we will see a move